travel really good for learning a language? Of course it is, right? We're surrounded by the language, we hear it everywhere, we see it on signs. Everything reinforces what we're learning. It's obviously great for learning a language. But is it? I actually think it's not a very effective way to learn a foreign language. In this video, I want to be radically honest about two things. First of all, why travel, especially travel to major tourist destinations, is actually not a very good way to learn a language. But I also want to be transparent about the limits of learning through comprehensible input and what my recent trip to Corsica revealed to me. Obviously, I teach through comprehensible input on this channel, so I clearly believe in its effectiveness. But on my trip to Corsica, I was confronted with a hard reality. Can we really learn a language to a really high level when we don't live in a country where it's spoken? And are there certain things we simply won't learn if we're not surrounded by the language in everyday life? Stick around, because there is an important qualification to all of this. As I said, maybe it's controversial, but I'm arguing that travel is not a good way to learn a language. Sure, traveling might motivate you to learn the language once you're there, but let's be honest, if that's the only time you start learning the language, sorry, you're never going to pick it up. So maybe you're thinking by now, if we're surrounded by the target language all the time when we travel, how is that not helpful? Well, think about what you actually say, or who you actually interact with. Usually, you're not striking up great conversations with strangers. You're talking to people at restaurants, bars, or stores. You're not talking to other guests, you're talking to the servers. And so you end up repeating the same phrases again and again. That might be useful for beginners, but it's pretty superficial. You usually don't get into real conversations. You're ordering something. You're buying something. It's an exchange, and then it's over. And for native English speakers, the struggle is real, folks. At least in European countries, most people learn English in school. So the moment they hear an English accent, they switch to English, thinking they're doing you a favor. This means that, especially if you're a native English speaker, traveling to a tourist area may be one of the worst ways to practice your target language, because the people working there want to practice on you. I can't tell you how often this happened to me on my last vacation in Corsica. And yes, I do realize I'm complaining at a very high level. We call them champagne problems in English, or first world problems. Here's the thing, I can speak French quite well. Of course I have an accent. So anyway, on several occasions I started chatting in French with a French waiter, and the waiter honestly looked disappointed and bored that I could speak French. He didn't want to chat with me in French. For him, speaking French was boring. Just like for me, speaking English was boring. And this happened at least 3 times while I was there. The people looked disappointed when I could converse in French. Other times, I didn't even get the chance to speak French because my wife was with me. She doesn't speak French, but she tried to order things in French anyway. So, of course, the servers immediately switched to English. Here's another important point, right? In these restaurants where my wife is speaking, we would sometimes reach a question that went beyond the usual restaurant English that they knew. So at this point, I would have to switch to French to clarify what we actually meant or what we were actually asking. And this was another thing that really frustrated me. I actually had a much higher level of French than the people who were speaking English had in English. Hope that makes sense. So these waiters there, they knew the typical restaurant phrases because they repeated them all the time. But if the conversation went beyond that restaurant script, they were lost. And for me, it was the exact opposite. I might ask a question in a slightly awkward way because I don't yet know the exact normal sounding phrase that the French people use in that particular situation. But I can express myself on any number of issues, including philosophical and political issues. Even if I say something a little differently from a native francophone, what I say is comprehensible and quite fluent. And this brings me to some radical transparency about this comprehensible input method of learning a language. If you don't know what comprehensible input is, I have a few videos explaining it, so check them out. I'll put the link in. As I said, I 100% believe it's the most effective way to learn a language. But to be completely honest, I did have difficulty asking certain basic questions in Corsica. And to be clear, I can speak for 10 minutes or longer without any problem about something like the development of religion and human spirituality, all sorts of things. But the first time I had to ask whether a bar was going to show the World Cup semifinal on TV, I asked the question a little awkwardly. I chose the wrong verb for show in that context. And so how is it possible that I can discuss the history of human spirituality, but I can't ask one completely normal question in a bar without making it sound strange? Well, that is a real limitation of learning primarily through comprehensible input, especially when you don't live in the country where the language is spoken. You can develop an enormous understanding of the language and still have gaps in very ordinary, everyday situations. You simply haven't encountered every phrase for every context. But here is the very important thing. These things are incredibly easy to learn once you already have this great knowledge of the language. I might have needed to look up a phrase really quickly, but then I remembered it almost immediately because I already knew all the words. I understand how the sentence works. I can pronounce everything correctly. I don't have to memorize a collection of unfamiliar sounds. I'm simply learning which words French speakers normally use in a given situation. So yes, if we learn through comprehensible input, we may not know every conventional phrase for every single everyday context we encounter while traveling. However, we will have this incredible base of knowledge that makes learning all of those things extremely fast. I'm convinced that if I could live for 1 month in a French city, I would become very, very fluent in these everyday situations. Not because I would learn French from scratch in 1 month, but because the French is already there. I would just be filling in the gaps. Now compare that with the other approach, learning travel phrases, right? You memorize a few phrases you need in a restaurant. Okay, great. What happens when the other person responds? You haven't memorized what they might say. And that's the problem with traditional approaches. As soon as someone goes off script, communication dies. And I fear that this is exactly what happens in tourist areas. I got the impression that a lot of Americans travel to France, try out a few memorized phrases, and then are immediately lost when the French person responds. Believe me, it was offensive to be treated like this. People heard my accent and assumed that I was another tourist who had memorized 2 sentences but wouldn't understand the answer. It was also nice to finally get past that stereotype. It wasn't all bad, friends. Once, while I was throwing away my trash, a French guy asked me if I had anything to recycle. As soon as I responded, he switched to English and asked me where I was from. I answered in French. I live in Germany. He then switched back to French, a little more shyly, and said, "Oh, I just thought because of your accent, it sounds a little English." I smiled and, still speaking French, explained that it was true what I told him. I do live in Germany, but originally I come from the United States. Then, in French, talking quite quickly to himself almost, he said that maybe these days it wasn't the best thing to tell people you're from the United States. Yeah, I agreed, again in French. Unfortunately, that does seem to be the case. And then suddenly his eyes grew wide. He seemed surprised and genuinely happy. And he said, "Oh, but you speak French." I had finally broken through the tourist stereotype. And I was able to have a great, spontaneous conversation that once again proved to me that learning through comprehensible input is the most effective method, even when it comes to speaking. So, is it actually better to learn through podcasts, YouTube videos, and books that interest us than to travel to the country where the language is spoken and immerse ourselves in it? My trip to Corsica greatly improved my French, but mostly because I used my beach time to read an academic book about Napoleon Bonaparte, who, by the way, was born right there in Corsica. The book really challenged my level of French, but I still understood most of it, so it was always interesting to read. Sadly, ordering food in restaurants and shops didn't really move the needle on my French. And honestly, I got better speaking practice with ChatGPT. But let me make a big qualification here. First of all, I'm talking about major tourist destinations during the high vacation season. The servers and shopkeepers have no desire to be my French tutor or conversation partner. They just want to do their jobs as quickly as possible. And obviously, seeing the language everywhere, hearing it everywhere, and being confronted with everyday situations in which I needed to use the language revealed holes in my French that I otherwise wouldn't have known about. That was extremely useful. So yes, real immersion is super helpful. And in the end, probably essential if we want to get truly close to a native level. But going on vacation and ordering at restaurants is not the same thing as genuine immersion. Using comprehensible input every day is still the most effective, pleasurable way to build a solid foundation and an extensive internal reference for the language. Then, when the time comes for us to be genuinely immersed in it, it won't take long before we feel really comfortable. And one closing thought. I wonder how many more conversations I would have had if my accent had been different. Say, for example, one associated with an Asian language. That is, what if all the francophones I spoke to had heard an accent associated with a language they had no idea how to speak? I can't help thinking I would have had more opportunities to continue speaking French. By the way, I talk about this and other ideas in a video titled, "Are Americans Bad at Languages?" I'll link that below as well. And what do you think about everything I've said? Am I completely wrong? Be sure to comment below. I'd love to hear your opinions and your experiences. And if you find this content helpful or interesting, be sure to like, comment, or subscribe. Maybe all three. It really helps me reach more people. Thanks, and I'll see you next time for more content in English naturally.